Perhaps the one economic news in the outgone week is the release of the second quarter gross domestic product figures for Nigeria. That report shows an economic growth of 5.1% for the second quarter of the 2021 relative to the same period in 2020. What is the implication of this recovery, especially relative to Nigeria's economic growth pattern since 2019? To take a look at this, I'm being joined by data and information consultant Babajide Ogunsanwo. Great to see you.
Good evening, Amarachi.
Good evening. You have been meeting with my other colleagues, so I know you're used to them already. But let's dig right into it, okay? The GDP result has social, political, and economic significance. What do these latest figures mean?
It means there's good news and there's bad news. And I'll talk a bit about the good and the bad news later. But regarding the GDP, there are three questions that we must answer. The first is, when last did Nigeria have this sort of 5% GDP growth? 1. 2 is, what does the GDP report really tell us? And 3, what does the GDP report fail to tell us? So let's start with the first. When did Nigeria have 5% growth prior to now? And the evidence shows the reason why this is big news is that the last time we saw a 5% economic growth of 5% was in 2014. In other words, in the last 7 years, we haven't seen this sort of GDP growth. 1. And the second thing is, what exactly led to this economic growth? What sectors out of the Nigeria's 46 sectors, economic sectors gave us or led this sort of growth? The report shows that 3 sectors topped the charts. Trade, number 1. Number 2, telecommunication. And number 3, the road transportation sector. It was these 3 sectors that gave us the sort of growth rate that the government is celebrating. These 3 sectors, the trade sector, telecommunication and information sector, which is the second sector, and the third sector, road transport, accounted for approximately a third of economic activity in the country. Now, the third thing is, what doesn't this report say? This report doesn't say anything about if citizens are satisfied with the quality of governance. Neither does this report say anything about the quality of life. So to sum it up for a common man, here's what this report really says.
Right.
Visualize a vehicle, a car. The GDP report tells you how fast the car is going. It doesn't just tell you what direction the car is going.
So would that be, the impact of this 5% growth?
And that's the challenge. And that's what I mean by good and bad news. The good news is that there's growth. The bad news is that we are not seeing value. And I would like to explain that with you with just one example before we look at the actual figures. And the example is, Amachi, imagine if you are on a salary, for the purpose of this discussion, of 100 naira last year. And if I choose to increase your salary by 5% from 100 naira, that means you will get 5 naira. 100 naira last year, a 5% growth on the 100, which means an additional 5 naira for you. But if your salary were 500 naira, and I increased it just by 2%, it means that you'll get an additional 10 naira, even though it was just a 2% increase. And that is really the summary of GDP. What we've seen is, prior to now, the economy wasn't growing as fast, but because the base was higher, there was more value created. So let's take a look at the exact figures so that we can understand what it means relative to other periods, because growth is good, but value is better. So we see, for instance, in 2019, that big number, 16.9 trillion naira. That was the GDP as at the second quarter of 2019. And we were able to achieve those sort of numbers even though the economy grew by 6%, by 2%. So a 2% growth in the second quarter of 2019 led to a 16.9 trillion naira GDP. And like the example I gave you before we took a look at this, it was because the base was already big. Now let's look at what we have today. We have 5% GDP, yes, which is the best result, even looking at all the second quarters that we've seen previously. Well, a 5% on what is the question we should ask ourselves? And it is a 5% of a low number. So yes, we have a 5% GDP, but now the GDP is only 16.7 trillion naira relative to is 16.9 trillion naira. It could be a bit confusing, but the summary is value is often better than growth. And that's why I use the example of what if your salary were 100 naira last year, and if I increased it by 5%, all you get is 5 naira. But if your salary were 500 naira, and I just increased it by 2%, you get more money in real terms. And that is what we should focus on. Not just growth, let's focus on creating value. How do we create value as a nation? Productivity. Over the time, we focus on growth. If we look at growth and we talk about growth, we need to ask ourselves, growth on what? What are we growing? From where?
So what value then has been placed on the common man via these figures that we're looking at?
So for the common man, some economists will want to look at not just looking at today's results, to look at what has happened prior and since this government has been in place. And that's what we should look at really, to be able to look at what sort of growth and development, because growth without development isn't complete. And the evidence shows less than 5% growth all throughout in 2015. The standard will be for an economy that has a population growth of approximately 3%. You need an economic growth of more than 3% for you to have some semblance of improved standard of living. We didn't get 3% in 2016. 2016 was more negative growth than even positive. 2017.
Do you have the figures for 2021 at least?
Yes.
Or 2020? But
what this has shown is that prior to now, the economy has been either in negative territory, in territory of between 0.1% to 2.5, 2.6%. Now we see 5%. There's some reason to smile, but there isn't sufficient reason to laugh. And that is what we need to remember. Some reason to smile, but these reasons are not sufficient
because we still don't have enough. That's what you're trying to say.
Because we still don't have enough, and we need to always remember the base. Reason to smile, but you're laughing. Reason to smile, but not
Babajide,
sufficient reason to laugh.
thank you so much. We never have enough time to have these conversations, but thank you. Thank you so much for coming. When the news at 10 returns, communities in Bayelsa State complain about degradation of the environment by oil companies and call the government to speed up cleanup efforts. That's in our community report tonight. Stay with us.